Chris, the new normal is savings are a priority. This is from a major banker in Australia.
That's right. One of the biggest bankers. Unpaid could be overpaid, by the way, but we'll give things a go. Gail Kelly has a point, but probably for the wrong reasons. She's quite right to talk about a new environment. The old environment was that people in Australia and overseas spent far too much, borrowed far too much. That's led to a reckoning, and how to resolve the reckoning, amongst several ways, is to spend much less, to borrow much less, and to save much more.
I think we call that, you said on this program many times that what your grandma told you was right.
That's exactly right.
Don't get into debt, save your pennies.
Yep.
Don't spend too much money.
And the flip side of that is what politicians are telling us and central bankers are telling us is flatly wrong, because what they are trying desperately to do is to make savings worthless. Your listeners will know those who've tried to live off their savings for the past several years have seen deposit rates plummet, allegedly as a result of so-called stimulus and an alleged recovery, which is about as legitimate or is about as genuine as a $12 banknote. So the bottom line is that around the world, there's a shortage of savings. How is that savings rebuilt? By providing incentives for people to save more. And what's the incentive to save more are things like higher deposit rates, higher interest rates. And it's quite right that the penalties for overborrowing are becoming more and more apparent. Unfortunately, though, governments are desperately trying to obfuscate, to hide, to obscure those penalties by bailing out their mates, not least of which are the banks, by making General Motors, the American auto industry, a ward of the state, and generally speaking, splashing around money as if there were no tomorrow.
Gail Kelly said customers who have savings will be rewarded. How can she reward a customer who has savings?
Oh, she can do so quite easily. There's nothing remotely preventing her from simply putting up deposit rates to a level that are higher than those of her competitors. Now, I'm guessing that she's going to think long and hard before she does that. Why? Because that's going to crimp the profit margins of Westpac.
But it should attract the deposit she's looking for, shouldn't it?
People respond to incentives. So if the incentive to savings is higher, namely if deposit rates rise, then that will provide a greater incentive towards savings. And notice, though, for banking, what she doesn't talk about is that that will make life a bit harder for banks. Why? The tsunami of lending which they've tried to put forth and largely have succeeded in putting forth, the higher our savings, the higher are those sorts of rates, the more their profit margins come under pressure, the less forward they're going to be, the less likely it is that they'll want to lend huge amounts of money.
But if we save more, it means our banks aren't as reliant on borrowing money overseas to lend to us. And those countries that have higher savings rates are countries that actually can build a manufacturing base, isn't it? They can actually build national assets.
Well, that's a critical point. That's to say, people who say a critical why save? Because it is savings which leads to investment. It's investment, successful investment, that leads to production, and it's production that leads to wealth and prosperity.
Genuine wealth.
Exactly right. It is not consumption that leads to prosperity and wealth. It's the process that begins with savings, through investment, and then through production. So
actually making something.
Well, it could be goods, it could be services, so whether it's the manufacturing sector or other sectors, but the point being that a source of domestic savings does, well, two things. One is, just as we've said, provides a basis for proper productive investment, but there's also a moral basis to this, and possibly, I would say, even more important than the economic aspect. He or she who has savings can sleep soundly at night. He or she who runs into financial difficulties is not, unlike the banks, by the way, going to run to the government whenever anything is the matter, because the banks are not savers, quite frankly. They run on very, very thin margins, and they're heavily reliant upon funding not from their shareholders, but either from depositors or from folks overseas. Our forebears were savers. Our forebears had that cushion when times were tough. They could draw upon savings. That's something which we forgot, and governments have tried strenuously, vociferously, desperately to encourage Australians to forget that lesson. They're effectively saying, oh, rely upon us when the going gets bad. Whatever you do, don't rely upon your own resources.